Hello and welcome. My name is Bénédicte de Montlore and I'm the President and CEO of World Monuments Fund. I'm delighted to welcome all of you for today's event about World Monuments Fund new projects for 2023. I'm so delighted to see that so many people are joining from everywhere in the world. So wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for taking the time. This is a really important topic. The needs of our field are immense. I cannot tell you, like every day we are receiving requests from partners all over the globe asking us to help them, to support them, to preserve their irreplaceable heritage. And that's why we are delighted that over the past few years, we've been able to grow our organization, to refine our strategy, to be better equipped to answer these needs. So I'm delighted to take you on that journey today around the world and to look at our new projects. And to do so, I'm joined by Jonathan Bell, Vice President of Programs at World Monuments Fund. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Benedict. Delighted to be here.
So we will start by giving you a quick overview of World Monuments Fund and our strategy in case you don't know us already, and then we will dive in projects. So first of all, I want to tell you that throughout this presentation, you will be able to ask your question just right in the chat. And at the end, we will try to go through as many of them as possible. So first of all, to give you an idea about World Monuments Fund. So we were created in 1965, so 57 years ago. And we started by, our first projects were in Venice. But very quickly we expanded. So we worked in 1966 in Lalibela in Ethiopia, a place where we've been many times since then. Started a project in 67 in Easter Island. One of our major projects is in Cambodia, and we started working there in 89. And I know many people know World Monuments Fund because of this incredible project in Cambodia, where we've been active for 30 years. Soon we realized that it's really important to be as local as possible to best answer the needs. So that's why we've opened affiliates. So in Spain, in Portugal, in Peru, in Britain, in India. In 2019, we created our crisis response program, and we always try to answer the needs when they appear. So 2020, we established a relief fund in response of the COVID-19 pandemic. And most recently, and we're going to talk more about that today, we launched in 2022, the Ukraine Heritage Response Fund. So I'm sure you have many questions about how we choose our projects, because once again, there are so many needs around the world. So we have at the moment 51 active projects in 34 countries. And Jonathan is going to explain you more about that, but we have different types of projects. We adapt to the local needs every place we go. So sometimes we develop what we call our signature project. Sometimes we go for a shorter period and we have some targeted interventions. We've been establishing some full-scale training programs, mainly in China and in the US, but also we are active in crisis response, in advocacy, and sometimes have an advisory capacity. So how do we choose our projects and what are our priorities? So once again, all over the world, we see needs appearing and so many places in need of intervention. So what we've decided was to address the major challenges and threats to heritage through our projects. What we are trying to accomplish is to develop model projects answering the local needs, but also developing groundbreaking methods and techniques that can be replicated in many places in the world. So identifying in conversation with all our partners around the world the main challenges to heritage, we've narrowed it down to those 4 elements that you're seeing here on the screen. So first, balanced tourism. As we know, tourism is essential for heritage places, because very often this is what brings income to the community around the site and to maintain the site. But of course, it's a double-edged sword, and sometimes heritage can really impact in a negative manner the heritage places where we work. So on this priority, we are developing with our partners as various projects some innovative strategy to best manage tourism, to make sure that the benefit goes back to the community and also that people can enjoy the sites while not impacting them negatively. Inclusive heritage is really important. Sometimes people can be surprised when we say, well, one of the main challenge is underrepresentation. And the truth is that we all know World Heritage sites, but the places that are the most vulnerable are very often places that are crucial for minorities, for vulnerable communities. So this is one of our priorities. We partner with marginalized communities around the world to develop strategies to help them preserve their heritage in a sustainable manner, but also to provide them economic opportunities around them. So our focus, and we will talk more about that, is about indigenous population, Jewish heritage, but also as a whole heritage in Africa. Climate change is top of mind for everybody today. This is a main threat to the world globally and of course to heritage itself. So this has been identified as one of the main priorities of the organization. And so we've decided to work at places where we can develop interesting strategies to mitigate climate change, but also sometimes to rehabilitate traditional techniques that help communities better handle the impact of climate change. Post-crisis recovery, we're going to talk about this very often, as we've seen in the past few weeks, unfortunately, in Syria and Turkey, we can see there is a giant impact on heritage places, and the communities are really trying not only to save their lives, but also to save their history and their identity. And this is in this kind of situation where a crisis strikes that we can see better than at any other moment the importance of heritage and the role it plays in communities. So so those are the global priorities that are really leading our action today. Then we have some more specific project criteria. So to decide on whether or not we're going to get involved in a project. So the first one is safeguarding irreplaceable cultural heritage that is at the heart of our mission. I'm sure many of you will think, well, so how do you define irreplaceable cultural heritage? And it starts with the community itself. Like, what is the value of this place to this community? What role does it play in the community? So this is what we assess with the community on the ground. Involving the local community, we don't decide anything from New York and send big international teams on the ground. We work always with local partners, the local stakeholders. So we assess if there is enough capacity on the ground, or if we need to build it to take on a preservation project. We need to answer an urgent need. There are so many places that need preservation around the world. We're trying to pick projects where the need is the most urgent. And finally, and this may seem obvious, but it's one of the most important criteria, is the project feasible? And that means many different things. Where is it located? Who are the stakeholders? Is there funding available, or can we find funding for this project? So these are all the criteria that we keep in mind. And if we look at the map of the new project map, so for 2023, we are announcing 11 new projects in 10 countries. And there are 3 signature sites, 5 targeted intervention, 2 crisis response, and 1 advocacy. And I think one important thing to say is how those projects come to us. Once again, it's a very bottom-up approach. Most of these projects are coming to us through our flagship program that is called the Watch program. Every 2 years, we invite people all around the world, and it can be government, it can be preservation organization, it can be professionals, professors, or just individuals to nominate the places that they think are important to the community, that they think present opportunity, and that they think are important preserving. We receive all those nominations. For instance, in the last cycle, we received 227 nominations. And with the help of professionals from ICOMOS, but also an international panel, we choose 25 sites that are going to become our priority. So this is the main pipeline of our project. It is the watch program. Aside from that, sometimes partners are bringing to us really very important projects that we take on with them. And of course, crisis response is outside of the cycle because we respond to emergencies happening right at the moment. So we are, these 11 projects correspond to $10 million in funding that we have gathered. One important thing to say is that we are not a grant-making organization. We are really a catalyst. We identify all these projects that we think are really important. We shape a team, we look at what's needed, and then we talk to our community of funders or to new funders to make this project happen. So we are really trying to bring all of those elements, and I think that's really the power of being a global organization, is that we can put all those people, sometimes the funder is in the US, but of course the project is at the other end of the world, and we put all of those people who really care about heritage together to make these projects happen. So Jonathan, maybe you can take us to some of our signature projects.
Absolutely. Thank you, Benedict. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm going to start by talking about two of our signature projects. And for us, our signature projects are really the best that WMF has to offer. Through these projects, we're able to commit a long-term relationship with local partners. And over the years, then we're also able to invest a large amount of money and time working with those partners to address a whole series of issues and challenges. So not only are we addressing critical needs that a site or place may have, we're also able to really fundamentally change and enhance how management is done, how conservation decisions are made, and how the whole practice of caring for these important places carries on. So let's start with the first site. We're going to start in the UK. We're going to go to a site that I know many of you are very familiar with. This is Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London in UK. And the fact that so many of you are familiar with it, I think, is a testimony to the fact that it is indeed a very important place, a place that is not only a wonderful visitor destination to see beautiful flowers, beautiful fungi as well, and see things that you would never be able to see in nature, but it's also an important center of research. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about why it is so important, as well as some of its history. So this is the largest and most diverse botanical and mycological collection in the world. So it's the largest gathering of plant and fungi samples from anywhere around the world. And I think in today's world, that's even more important than it has been for the 100 or so years that it's been in existence, because we're always hearing on news about diminishing biodiversity around the globe. And this is really a kind of microcosm of biodiversity, with samples taken from everywhere around the world. And we can conduct research as well as experience a lot of these incredible things. A little bit about the history of the place. The land, the estate, was first acquired in 1731 by the Prince of Wales. And a little bit less than 30 years later, there was an exotic garden, as it was called, that was established. And that really is the birth of the gardens, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. A little bit less than 100 years later, the land and the gardens were given over to the national government. And they continued to grow both in terms of area and also in terms of the specimens that came from around the world, all the way into the early 20th century until it reached the size and kind of collection extent that it is today. In 2003, the site was named a World Heritage Site. So this means that it is recognized as having outstanding universal value for all of humanity. And I think we can see why this is the case. And of course, for those of you who have visited, You know it's a top tourist attraction in London. So that means that this also has incredible value, social value and economic value for London and for the UK beyond. If we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what we're doing here. So our work is focused on the Palm House. And as you can see in the structure, this image, it's an incredible structure composed largely of cast iron and glass. And it's really one of the kind of foremost or principal models for greenhouses created. And of course, there have been many greenhouses of various types that copy this structure and model around the world. And I think something that's very important to remember when you look at this is to consider that inside we have the environment for a tropical rainforest. And keep in mind what happens in London throughout the year, especially in the winter. These are two very different climates. And so there's a lot of energy, a lot of work to keep that, maintain that microenvironment for the plants that are growing inside. We'll see in the next image some of those interior shots, and you can see some of the great specimens that are growing palms and bamboo and other specimens from tropical parts of the world. But as you look more closely, you also see that the structure is in need of some care. You can see rusting structural members, some of that iron that's rusting. Hard to see in the photo, but there are some challenges with some of the glass that, of course, is not as efficient in terms of energy saving approaches as it could be. And so this is really the moment after this structure that was built in 1844, a moment to step back and think about its future in terms of caring for the physical structure, but then also the future in terms of its management and energy use. So on the next slide, we'll look at what really we're doing at this site. The first piece, of course, is to study and protect the fabric. So all of these rusting elements that you see, addressing those challenges, making sure that the glass is intact and thinking about more efficient forms of glass that could be used. And in this process, a key part of this that is a really innovative strategy in a tall order is to try to develop a strategy for carbon neutrality. And what that means is all that's required to maintain this tropical microclimate, despite perhaps a cold London winter on the outside, and all the energy required to do that, that at the end of the day, operations of this building, we would try to figure out a way to make sure there was a net zero carbon footprint to do all of these things. It is a tall order, but it's a challenge that we're up for, and we're working with, obviously, our partners at Kew, but also a number of specialists and experts to do all the studies and research required to get us there. And this, of course, is a way that we're engaging with climate change, a key project that allows us to talk about not only adaptation, but very unique, because we're able to talk about mitigation and actually limiting the impact that management of historic structures has on our environment and in the exacerbation of climate change. Another part of this is to enhance the visitor experience. We want to make sure that visitors really understand this place, understand the scientific purpose of the Palm House, as well as are able to be drawn in and understand where the specimens are coming from, and think of this as a microcosm of the whole world, the whole tropical world that we see around the world. In addition, this is a wonderful example. As I said, this is kind of the primordial greenhouse in many ways. And so whatever we do here, both in terms of physical conservation and in terms of developing new management and energy strategies, we can develop that into a model for similar greenhouses around the world. So it's creating kind of a best practices playbook that can be used in many other places. And now I'm going to quickly move around the world. We said we would take you on a world journey. We're going to go to Peru. And so we are in northern Peru at the Rio Abiseo National Park. This is an incredible and expansive landscape, and we'll see on the next slide a few details about what this place really is, and also an incredible image. I think it makes us all dream to see this beautiful image. But this is a huge landscape of 3,000 square kilometers, so very large. And within that area, you have a number of different climatic zones and ecoregions that are very distinct from each other. And what that means is, we were just talking about biodiversity and how that is diminishing in so many parts of the world. This is a place where you have very rich biodiversity in flora and fauna, and it's intact. And in fact, this is a protected biosphere for that reason. However, we also have an incredibly rich cultural landscape. And this is a landscape that is the legacy of the Chachapoya civilization, a civilization that thrived from about the 10th century all the way to near the end of the 15th century. And also were known to trade and have less friendly altercations with the Inca and other neighbors. And they have left us an incredible rich cultural legacy that we'll see some images of in a moment. As I said, this is a protected biosphere. It was designated a natural protected area in 1983, and it also has been recognized as a World Heritage Site, a mixed World Heritage Site in 1990, which means that it's recognized for both its natural values, all of this biodiversity, flora and fauna, but also the incredibly rich cultural heritage that is part of the landscape. So if we go to next slide, we'll see some wonderful images, and you can see on the left some of the different topography and these different types of kind of eco-regions that you have throughout the park. And on the right, the four images, you see some of the incredibly rich and diverse life, both flora and fauna, that thrive in the park. And I love this image of this miniature tree frog sitting on this person's finger in the upper right-hand corner. It really makes you think about how rich this place is. But let's go to the next slide and we can see some of the examples of the cultural legacy that is scattered throughout the park. And you see some of the incredible architectural embellishment and decorative motifs that are on these Chachapoya structures. And in the upper right-hand corner, you may notice in the shadow there some skulls and bones. And so we also have some very important funereal and burial sites of the Chachapoya. And let's go to the next slide and we can talk about what we're doing with this project. So the first thing that we aim to do is develop a conservation plan. Now, this is a large site with a huge amount of cultural heritage. How are we doing this and why are we doing this? Why? Because there's a great need. A lot of the heritage that's there, small sections and sites have been documented. There's been a lot of wonderful and rich research done over the years, but there's a real need for conservation at many of these places to make sure they're not entirely swallowed by the natural environment. And the how is that we're going to use the information that exists, rely on the very hard work of our predecessors, and also add to it, building on additional documentation and creating pathways and kind of a roadmap for what needs to be done in the future, where are the priorities and what type of work needs to be done. We will be carrying out conservation at two of the more famous sites, and also doing emergency stabilization and other work at some of the other sites throughout the park. And of course, as Benedict has mentioned, all of our work involves local stakeholders. And this site is no different than any other, but it's perhaps even a bit more complicated than some because this is a national park. All the flora and fauna are protected at the national level. The cultural heritage is protected. So you have a lot of Peruvian government entities that have to come together, as well as the local communities who live in the fringes of the park and who consider this place to really be their own and part of their own identity. So we're going to work to bring all of these various entities and stakeholders together to develop a plan for the care of this place as one group. And as I said, we'll be documenting and mapping and also adding to the rich documentation and information that already exists. So let's move on to the next slide and we'll look at two of the sites. The first is Los Pinchudos. This is an incredible site that was used as a kind of funereal complex. Some of these structures do still have ossuaries in them. They have bones and remains of Chachapoya. And you can see there are a number of structures that are clinging to this cliffside and of course also have an incredible view. But they're really incredible structures with wonderful architectural decorative embellishments. And the second site that we'll be focusing on is perhaps the most famous of the Chachapoya sites within the Abiseo National Park. And this is Gran Bajaten. This is one of the earliest sites that was rediscovered in modern times. And we'll be focused on one of the structures that is in kind of critical need of conservation. So before we go to targeted interventions, Benedict, I want to turn it back to you and see if you want to say anything else about our signature projects. Benedict, I think you're muted.
Yeah. Now, I think one of the main things I want to say is that, as you can see, these are very challenging projects, very ambitious projects, and that's why we are getting involved. Like one of our main questions is why would World Monuments Fund get involved? And this is because this is a challenge that we want to take on, and we think we can do it with the local partners. Another thing, we want to develop some groundbreaking initiative. And the other thing is that we want to give back to the community. And I think this is particularly relevant for this project in Peru, where we want to study ways in which the community can not only access this heritage that is not that well known and that is really important, and also how it can provide resources to them. So before we move on from the signature project, I really want to mention the third one because it's in Portugal and very dear to my heart. I visited it. It's these murals that are at the maritime stations in Lisbon. And those are paintings that were done by Almada Negreiros between 1943 and 1945. And that was a moment where there was an authoritarian regime in Portugal. And what's interesting is that Almada Negreiros, who is a painter from African Portuguese descent, he was commissioned and he decided to rebel and not to do paintings at the glory of the regime, but quite the opposite way. Those paintings tells the stories of the people who emigrated or of the people who came to Portugal. And it's really simple people. It's exploring African identity. It's exploring the life of all of those who cross paths in this place at the port of Lisbon. And what's interesting to us is first, of course, to restore these paintings that are incredibly beautiful and important, but also to work with the city of Lisbon to provide better public access. For now, those paintings are not that well known. And so the whole idea is to find strategies to really develop the whole area and to allow the people of Lisbon to come and also tourists to go there. And finally, the third goal is really to highlight this history behind those murals and the work of Almada Negreiros. So that's the third of our signature project that we are announcing today. And I think it's a really interesting one. So now let's move to some targeted intervention, Jonathan.
Yes, so we're going to continue our trip around the world and move to West Africa, but I'll just say a few words about targeted interventions, which are exactly what they sound like. The idea here is really to have a targeted approach to a very specific critical need. And so although some of our targeted interventions are the basis and do turn into signature projects where we have this long-term engagement, here we're really focused on a specific need, trying to address that, and of course making sure that our local partners can continue the work once we're gone. So we're coming to Burkina Faso, as I said, in West Africa, and I think we can go to the next image. We are in the capital, Ouagadougou, of Burkina Faso, and at the Maison du Peuple, or the House of the People. This is a very important site for Burkinabe, as the people of Burkina Faso are called, because it really is symbolic of their nationhood and the independence movement. And we can go to the next slide and see some additional images. And you'll see that I'll talk a bit about the building in a moment, but this really ties into a larger movement across much of Africa, of African modernism, that many of these modern structures using concrete typically as a building material, but often borrowing from more local vernacular traditions in terms of decorative elements and form and shape, were very symbolic of the newfound independence in many countries across Africa. And so this building, the Maison du Peuple, was commissioned in 1960, which is actually the year of independence of Burkina Faso. And it was finally inaugurated in 1965. And I just want to highlight, and we can go to the next image because I think we'll see things a bit better. I want to highlight some of this wonderful patterning and some of these elements that relate to Burkinabe vernacular architecture. So you see, of course, in the rounded form, but also this beautiful patterning in the concrete that is reminiscent of many traditional buildings that you find across the country, and also of textiles that you find in the country. So there's a wonderful element and vocabulary there that comes from true Burkinabe culture. In addition, these lanterns that you see on top copy and form other vernacular buildings and architecture across the country. So it's a really kind of whimsical building that is really representative of modern day Burkina Faso. And before we move on, I just want to highlight also this large plaza that you see. So the use of the building is not just limited to the building itself, but it's also this larger site that is often the place for markets, fairs, even protests when they've happened. And of course, many of you will be familiar with the many coups, unfortunately, that Burkina Faso has suffered in recent decades. And often there's a military action or some sort of activity that takes place on this very plaza. So this is really the center of the city and the heart of conversation of citizens of the country and residents of Ouagadougou. So let's go to the next slide and we can talk about what this, well, first we'll look at the interior. And so you can see the interior form. It's an auditorium type structure. It's been used, continues to be used for concerts. And of course, was very importantly the site of political meetings for many decades after it was first built. But you can also see that this building has seen better days. It needs some tender loving care. There's a lot of water infiltration, other challenges with the structure that need to be dealt with. And so our project, as we'll see on the next slide, really focuses on raising awareness of the need for this building, and in addition, bringing kind of the field of conservation to Burkina Faso. And I say that because there are no professional training programs in conservation in the country, and only 2 professional architecture programs in the country. So we're going to be working with local architecture students and young professionals and kind of working with them side by side to do a full condition assessment of the building and come up with key recommendations of how the building needs to be treated and addressed. And so through that process, we'll be introducing a new generation to key conservation and heritage approaches that are not really accessible in the country right now. Although this building and the image of the building is emblazoned on the memories and hearts of many Burkinabe, as you see, it needs some care. And so we want to really raise awareness about the importance of the structure and its ties to this larger African modernist movement, as well as modernism around the world. But also we want to draw attention to the need for its conservation and need for its care, and play a role in obviously revitalizing the site through various community activities, exhibitions, workshops, etc. And so now I will turn it back over to you, Benedict.
Thank you, Jonathan. And this is a great example of one of our targeted intervention. So just to say one word about that, these targeted projects are very diverse because once again, we focus on the need of our local partners. So sometimes a targeted project is developing a conservation plan. Sometimes it's doing physical preservation of one part of a place. Sometimes it's developing an advocacy program because this place is at risk of being destroyed. And we are always led by the need of the local community. And that's where our watch program is so important, because in the first place, it is these local partners or individuals or government telling us what their need is. And then we try to respond with them as well as we can. Of course, sometimes some of those targeted intervention becomes bigger, larger signature site where we have a longer involvement of WMF. One aspect we haven't touched upon yet too much is crisis response, because this is when crisis hit, it's really one of the moments where everybody becomes aware of the importance of heritage. We've seen it numerous times, very recently in Ukraine or with Turkey and Syria. I think most of the time people take heritage for granted, or they think it's a long-term endeavor that we don't need to focus on. And obviously, when a crisis hit, we see how much it is necessary to intervene rapidly. So our main goals in crisis response is, one, to raise awareness about the importance to protect heritage, and also the increasing destruction of cultural heritage by disaster or by conflict. I think we all have in mind that heritage is increasingly targeted during conflict times. We all remember Iraq, Syria, but also Mali. And so that's why we really want to raise our voice along with our partners to protect heritage in this time of disasters. We are mobilizing funds to help immediately local partners on the ground. So we gather information and we talk to everyone and see how we can support in a very short-term manner. And finally, very often we develop larger scale project when the situation has stabilized a little bit, and when we can work with a local partner to develop and to preserve places that have been hit either by a natural disaster or by conflict. So if we move to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine, because this is an example of what we are doing. So unfortunately, next week, we are going to commemorate the tragic one-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine. And at the very beginning of that crisis, it became apparent that heritage was targeted and was at the center of this conflict, because it's a war about history, about identity. So immediately we mobilized, we talked to our former partners on the ground. We had projects in the past in Ukraine, but we also talked to the major international stakeholders who care for heritage. So UNESCO, obviously, the Smithsonian, Blue Shield, ALIF, to see what everybody was doing and how we could complement each other. We raised funds, and we are very grateful to the Helen Funkenthaler Foundation, who gave us some seed funding of $500,000 to allow us to intervene rapidly. So we recruited a Ukrainian heritage specialist, Katerina Goncharova, who has been active on the ground since the very beginning of the crisis. And this is what allowed us to provide different things that were very much needed by heritage professionals and also just regular civilians who are trying to protect their places. So we provided fire extinguishers, we digitized archives, we put temporary structures to preserve places that either had been impacted or that were where conservation was underway and were under the elements and couldn't be protected in time of war. Then we participate, more recently, we participated in some documentation and assessment of damage in some liberated zones. And now we are looking at a bigger project of rehabilitation that we could in the future, when the situation stabilizes, conduct in the country. So we've developed 9 projects, and we are, thanks to our team on the ground, in contact, a constant contact with all heritage professionals in Ukraine to really protect this very important heritage. So one thing I want to say about crisis response is that it's really important, of course, to act immediately and to gather the fund and to gather the information and the expertise necessary to intervene in places like Ukraine and more recently Syria and Turkey. But we should also pay attention to places that, in fact, are not talked about in international media, but that also are facing a crisis and disaster, and that need, when we can, like support. So Jonathan, you're going to give an example of that in Sumba Island.
Yes, Benedict. So if we go to the next, yes, thank you. We can, where we're going now, we promised you a trip around the world, and we are delivering, I hope. So we are now in Sumba Island. This is in the southernmost province of Indonesia, a province known as East Nusa Tenggara. And it's a really incredible island of, about 800,000 people or so. And the Sumbanese people have a wonderful vernacular architecture. And you see some examples of it here on the right. These large post buildings with these central, very tall thatched roofs. And there is a tradition and ceremony and a religious component to the design and the construction, the actual building of each of these. If we go to the next slide, we can just get a sense of traditional Sumbanese life. And we are focused in particular on the village of Wanyapu in Sumba, on the island of Sumba. And you can see here again, some of these structures. Wanyapu is famous because it has so many of these traditional buildings, almost 50, it had almost 50. And you can get a sense also of just some of the landscape, where you see the buildings marking that landscape, and aspects of the lifestyle, and of course the people, who are really the central part of everything we talk about with culture and heritage. And why are we talking about this in terms of crisis? Well, we'll go to the next slide. And you will see a really horrific event. This was in September, on September 20th, just last year, 2022, a large fire broke out that consumed 30 of the 50 or so buildings, traditional buildings in this village. And what's even more, I guess, more surprising and shocking is the fact that this was the fourth fire in the region in recent years. And of course, this relates to, as we've been talking about in a few cases already, climate change. And the fact that as climate change is impacting rainfall patterns, more rain is falling in smaller periods of time. And that means you have longer, drier periods that are also quite warm, which of course exacerbates the risk for fire. So what are we doing here? If we go to the next image, we are really aiming to work with this village to raise awareness about these threats, but also conduct some study. We'll be working with some climate scientists and others to really understand the impact of climate change in this very specific part of Indonesia, and working very closely with the community to help them understand some of these risks, and of course also develop mitigation strategies and prevention measures so that they can make sure that they can keep this vernacular tradition alive and safeguard the structures that they have in place. And now I'm going to change gears and go to another type of project. We're coming to Australia. And this is, Benedict had mentioned earlier, advocacy and our role in advocacy. This is very much a project that falls in that camp. And what we do in our advocacy programs or advocacy projects, a key part of what we do is really to provide a platform for local voices, a way for people to tell their story, talk about what's important to them, make sure their narratives reach a broader audience. And of course, when we can, we provide tools and other assistance to make that happen and structure that whole process so that it's as effective and efficient and far-reaching as possible. So we're going to talk a little bit about Kinchela Aboriginal Boys Training Home. This is a very different type of site from the other sites we've been talking about. It's a site of memory, a site of pain, but also a site of healing. And many of you will be familiar with the history in Australia of the stolen generations throughout much of the 20th century, when children of Aboriginal descent were literally ripped from their homes, taken from their families, and sent to training institutions to be assimilated, basically to become more white. And the Kinchela Aboriginal Boys Home is one of the kind of most infamous and notorious of these. What we should say is that in addition to the unbelievable trauma of being ripped from one's family and one's way of life, lifestyle, way of learning as well, particularly Kinchela Aboriginal Boys Training Home, many of the children, and there were over 400 boys over the years that it was in operation, many of the children were very horribly physically abused as well. So this is a place of real pain. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what we're doing here. So the key thing that we want to do is, that we are doing already, is to work with the survivors. And as you can imagine, many of the survivors are quite old. We've had a few to pass away since we've begun this process and begun this conversation with our local partners. And so we want to record and preserve their oral histories. And we're working with them so that they are in complete control of this process, telling the stories they want to tell in the way they want to tell it. And of course, controlling the storage, the access, and the future access of all these oral histories. At the same time, we're adding a spatial component to this. So this place that is still in existence will have a way of, in future visitation, you'll be able to understand what happened where and link specific stories, specific events to specific places. So there is this kind of spatial richness and experience that will occur as this becomes a place of truth-telling, as our local partners like to say, where they're telling their truths, telling what happened to them, and also beginning to heal. And some of the stories that are coming out have never been shared even with their own families their own children and grandchildren. So it's the first time that these are being told in this kind of structured, systematic way. And it's really helping to promote healing. And if we go to the next image, you can just see some of the activities that have already begun. You see here, the upper left, just a site plan, if you can make it out. But of course, this is really about working with the community of survivors, letting them reminisce and recount their memories, both good. We hope there are some good ones, but also obviously a lot of negative ones. And often there's a lot of intergenerational conversation that's happening where they're bringing their families and they're sharing this with their families at the same time. And we have a last image for this particular project, the next slide, which shows the group of survivors sitting under this tree. And they are adamant that this is a process that is helpful to them. And not only is it a story that needs to be told, so all Australians and the world can understand what they went through in their experiences, but so that they can really support and embrace this process of healing. And so we're very, very proud and honored to be able to support that process. Benedict, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm sure like all of you, 200 people who are like traveling with us, it's a whirlwind of project because we are very excited about these and we want to share as much information as possible. We are not going to be able to go to all these places that you see now on the screen, but you will have our press release with all the projects, and we are always at your disposal to answer any question you may have about these places. I see, for instance, at the bottom here, you have Teotihuacan, where we're really looking into continuing the effort of the Mexican authorities and stakeholders for better tourism management. And the goal here is to involve and to make sure that the local villages around the site benefit from the millions of tourists who are going there every year. You see also Abydos, a place that is so important for the history of Egypt, but that is not that well known and that people don't go to. So there is a great opportunity for incredible conservation work, but also developing the tourism management plan there. I want to say a word about our traditional water management systems, because one of the advantages of being a global organization is that we are seeing common themes appearing across the world. And for instance, in the last watch cycle, we've seen coming to us many projects dealing with restoration of traditional water management techniques. And in here you have two examples, one in Nepal and one in Peru, but this is also an issue we are working on in India. And the idea here is that, of course, we are not going to solve the whole water crisis that is happening in so many places in the world, only thanks to traditional water management systems, but we can help mitigate this crisis by rehabilitating those centuries-old management systems that have been put together for centuries. And so we're working, you can see here, with the community in Nepal to restore those very beautiful, intricate structures, to understand why some of them are not working anymore, because there was a whole, there were decades during which they were abandoned for some of these structures. Those you can see are still in use, but some of them were abandoned, and we want to rehabilitate them. It's the same in Peru, where we have in the mountain some traditional water management techniques that are very necessary today, especially when glaciers are melting and this water needs to be captured. So those are very important water management projects. And what we love about them is that it's about preservation of very important architectural structure that have a contemporary social impact for communities today that will really change the life of people and communities surrounding the sites today. So, of course, as I was telling you before, we don't do any of that by ourselves. We are a catalyst. We receive all those great nominations from all over the world. We have teams that are specialized in each region and working with local partners, and we raise funds. And so I want to thank our wonderful 2023 new project supporters. None of that would be possible without them. And all those projects are conducted thanks to their support. So we are really, really grateful to all of them. So now I want to go through some of the questions. So one first question was about our geographic repartition. So when we select our projects, and especially through the watch, but also other projects that come to us, of course, we look at needs, and we look also as at the balance, a geographical balance of our portfolio. So for now, we have 14 sites in Asia, 16 in Africa and the Middle East, 11 in Europe, 3 in North America, 6 in Latin America, and 1 in Australia. And one thing I want to mention, because we've grouped here Africa and the Middle East, but there is an incredible need that we are seeing in Africa. And we would love to do more projects in Africa. We are incredibly grateful to the State Department and the Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation, because they are the main providers of funding for projects in Africa. What we are seeing is that it's one of the regions for which it's a most difficult to raise funds for. And I think it's because heritage in Africa is not very well known. A lot of potential funders have not traveled there, but this is where also you have an incredible diverse heritage, and that we need to find more funding to do this project. So please help us and join us in this endeavor, because heritage in Africa really needs more preservation, and we want to keep that focus and to be able to work there. I think we have many questions, and this is very natural because we are all horrified about what happened in Syria and Turkey. So maybe, like, of course, the team is hard at work, identify what we can do there. So Jonathan, do you want to say a word about that?
Absolutely, and thank you everyone for all of these questions and concern. We here at World Monuments Fund are also very concerned. We have a long-standing project in Eastern Turkey that doesn't seem to have been affected by the earthquake, but not very far from the epicenter. And we also have worked in Syria and have on our team a Syrian colleague. So we are following the news as best we can, and there's a lot of news coming out every day. But as Benedict mentioned at the beginning of Ukraine, we're following that same sort of process where in the early days, it's such mayhem, it's very difficult to understand what's happening and where the immediate needs are. And so we're gathering and compiling as much information as possible, while also talking to all of our colleagues, other organizations that do the type of work that we do, humanitarian assistance organizations and others. So we've been talking with the World Bank, with the UN, with the Getty Conservation Institute and others who are in this field and following the news. And right now we're in that information gathering phase, but our goal is to be able to understand where and how we might be able to help in some way in the coming weeks and begin to put something together to be able to support what is an immense need on the ground.
Thank you, Jonathan. So here I see another question about how do we advocate in the global public sphere, not only engage with local stakeholders, but how do we gain general public support and opinion? Well, this is really important, and we want more people to join us in this endeavor. We are trying as much as we can to talk about the projects, to talk about the need. I think our watch program has been very effective in this manner, showing where the most important needs and challenges are. And we are continuing doing this work, but not only for us, of course, we want to grow our organization and our capacity to work with communities everywhere, but we think it's important for people around the world. We believe in the mission and everybody can carry this mission. It's not only through WMF. So we're continuing talking to press, talking to people around the world, trying to highlight the need and the importance of heritage so that persons at their local level can engage into preservation work. That is so key. I'm trying to answer another question. We have someone in Mexico who wants us to get involved in supporting some particular churches and convents, and asking us how do we candidate to the watch, and how can we have a look at previous nomination. So we will launch next year a call for nomination for the watch process, and we have a team here that is really helpful and very knowledgeable and can work with nominators if they have questions to make sure that your nomination is as strong as possible. Of course, like then it's so difficult because we see so many places that are worth of intervening, and we try to help, but it's always a very difficult choice. So Jonathan,
I see a few questions about the balanced tourism piece, and I thought maybe we could, since we didn't get to talk about Teotihuacan, we could say a few words about that, because that's a good example.
Yeah.
It's a very challenging problem, but one of the key things that we have recognized and that we're often being told by our local partners is that many times local communities feel left out of the tourism process because maybe a site is managed by the national government or managed by some other entity. They're not allowed access. They're not given permits to benefit from tourism that takes place. And that's part of the challenge in Teotihuacan, where it's a huge site and there are a lot of local communities all around the site that want to be part of this process, want to actually benefit and make money from tourists selling food and trinkets and wares and other things, but also just want to feel part of the process of managing and taking care of the site. And it's not that the authorities are unwilling, but how does one do that? And so that's often a role we play, where we really play a role of facilitation and help to bring the stakeholders together so they hear each other, they listen to each other, and then create a plan to move forward so they can work together and everybody feels that they're part of this process and actually are, and have that benefit. So that's part of the Teotihuacan project we didn't get to talk about, but that we're also launching today.
Thank you, Jonathan. So, many people are also asking, how can I get involved? So, you have our email, our contacts. The answer is, it depends. Each one of you can get involved in a different way. So, and we are, I think, a very large and open global family where we hope we can be as participatory as possible. And we are definitely working on this because we think this is a global endeavor that everybody should participate in. So on this note, unfortunately, we cannot go through each of the sites, but I want to thank all of you for participating in this event, for participating more generally in heritage work, which is so key for communities, for preserving history for future generations. So thank you all, and I hope to see you virtually or in person in the coming weeks and months. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.